Welcome. The United States has often been described as a melting pot, and on our country's Great Seal, we find the Latin phrase E pluribus unum, that is, out of many, one. But how should we think about the United States in a historical sense? Is there just one way to tell the American story? And what's at stake in framing it one way rather than another? So, today's lecture is a somewhat philosophical exercise. We'll look at three possible frames of reference: British American, Spanish American, and then more broadly at religion. Along the way, we'll introduce counterfactual reasoning and use it to emphasize the multifaceted nature of American history. As a political entity, there's no escaping the fact that U.S. history begins with Britain. After all, the American Revolution was fought first and foremost against the British Crown. But, despite our rebellion, colonial British America still offers various touchstones for national history and identity to the modern United States. Perhaps surprisingly, our own American approaches to colonial British America can both clarify and distort American history at the exact same time. To take just one example, consider the Pilgrims. They have often been portrayed as the fountainhead of later U.S. history. Because they rejected and fled from the state church in England, it is very easy to draw a direct line of connection between the Pilgrims and the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, which rejects, at the federal level, any kind of state religion. But appealing to the Pilgrims also distorts. Despite popular assumptions, the Pilgrims were not the first British colonists to settle in what became the American colonies. Rather, that distinction belongs to those who settled in Virginia. But, unlike their fellow countrymen in New England, British Virginians were more loyal, in both religion and in politics, to the British Crown. So, emphasizing the Pilgrims is basically cherry-picking. It makes the American Revolution seem more justifiable. And perhaps ironically, this emphasis actually occludes the many ways in which the British roots of American history and culture remain present still today, sometimes in surprising ways. For example, the popular American patriotic song, "My Country 'Tis of Thee," actually derives from the British patriotic song, "God Save the King." The lyrics have changed, but the tune has largely remained the same. My country 'tis of thee. Thanks, Britain. But, while the first 13 states rebelled against the British Crown, the same cannot be said of the vast stretch of territory that eventually became the next 37 states. They had no connection to Britain. But many had been connected to another international empire, the Spanish Empire. And this means that, as the colonies expanded westward, they often expanded into Spanish-speaking lands. We see this in the names of numerous states. Consider Colorado. It's Spanish for ruddy. Or consider Montana. It's Spanish for mountainous. And the list goes on. Arizona, California, Nevada, etc. Notably, the oldest continually inhabited city in the United States is St. Augustine, founded in 1565 by the Spanish, is located in the state of Florida. And Florida is Spanish for flowery. If we think of the tangible ways that Spanish cultures have shaped the United States, we might first think of food, and that's fair enough. But this influence is not new. Consider Zorro, the swashbuckling anti-hero, whose tales are set in Spanish California during the early 19th century. Zorro was invented by the popular American author Johnston Macaulay of Ottawa, Illinois, and Macaulay published his first Zorro story in 1919. Some think that Macaulay was inspired by Joaquin Murrieta, a possibly legendary outlaw who became something of a folk hero among Spanish-speaking Californians. But whatever Zorro's origins, there's no doubting his influence. You need look no further than the American comic book hero Batman, whose parents were murdered after his family had gone to see the film The Mark of Zorro. We've looked now at just two ways that American history might be framed. Each way approaches American history from a different national background, one British, the other Spanish. To synthesize these, we might say that U.S. history is in part about rebellious, former British colonies that expanded into non-British territory. Some of this territory was European, and so, quite rapidly, the United States began to embody diverse European nations, foods, and customs, and this despite the fact that many of these European nations were political rivals and sometimes enemies. Consider Louisiana, a former French colony named after King Louis XIV. It entered the American Union in 1812. In 1848, the Mexican-American War concluded, with a portion of Mexico now incorporated into the United States. So, by the mid-19th century, you could say that the United States had become, at the very least, an Anglo-Franco-Spanish nation. But there were other peoples here too. Most obvious are the African Americans, largely brought through slavery, and the many indigenous nations collectively known today as Native Americans. Controls on immigration have waxed and waned throughout U.S. history. But, as time has passed, a diversity of other groups within Europe, and more recently beyond it, have also become part of the American story. Sometimes this has brought friction, but it has also brought enrichment. Just think of food. Do you like bagels? Think Jewish immigrants. Do you like Cuban sandwiches? Think Cuban immigrants. And the list goes on. But a very significant part of the American story is an aspiration that goes all the way back to 1782 with the original design for the Great Seal of the United States. It's expressed in the Latin motto, E Pluribus Unum. That is, out of many, one. But of course, there are still other ways to frame American history. Consider religion. If we circle back now to our initial framework of British colonial history, we'll hear a familiar story. In the 17th century, hoping to worship freely, small numbers of religious dissidents began leaving England for the New World. We generally call these pilgrims or Puritans. Their pursuit of religious freedom did not always result in a willingness to grant others the same freedom. But, despite this, the Bill of Rights begins, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Here we see religious freedom front and center. But let's circle now back to our second framework, that of Spanish America. What happened when post-British Protestant Americans entered Spanish America? Well, they found that another form of Christianity was dominant, Catholic Christianity. And when we look at some 19th century immigrants, we also find that they were Catholic. And yet, Protestants and Catholics had a long history of animosity, to say the least. So, in the 19th century, a largely Protestant United States was made to wrestle with the fact that growing numbers of citizens were not Protestant, and some Protestant Americans sought to prevent the growth of Catholicism, and even the creation of Catholic schools. Catholic Americans had to fight to enjoy the same civil rights that Protestant Americans already enjoyed. From this standpoint, perhaps American history is less of a religious project than it is an ecumenical project, one in which Christian groups, some of whom truly hated one another, had to live together in a single legal framework. In time, these religious groups largely came to recognize each other as equally American, even if they were sometimes still skeptical that each was equally Christian. Other religious groups have since contributed to American religious diversity. The idea of a Judeo-Christian tradition is one outcome of that diversity. It was first advanced for the simple sake of encouraging Protestants, Catholics, and Jews to recognize one another as equally American. The religions of other immigrants are more recent and much smaller, but I'm willing to bet that many, and perhaps most, Americans now operate with a default assumption that religion is not a bar to citizenship. So what? Today we've looked at a few ways that American history can be framed. Two were imperial, that is, British and Spanish. One was religious, but mostly Christian. We might now ask, what happens if we remove these? This is called a counterfactual. By definition, it's something that didn't happen. It is literally counter to the facts. But hopefully, by using counterfactual reasoning, we might come to see the facts themselves a bit more clearly. So, for example, what would happen if we removed the British element from American history? Well, we couldn't make sense of any number of things, such as the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. And it's literally impossible to imagine the United States without these. We could also ask, what would happen if we removed the Spanish element from American history? Well, we wouldn't be able to comprehend the names and histories of multiple states. We would miss out on some excellent food, and select storylines in popular entertainment would change radically. After all, what would happen if the young Bruce Wayne and his parents didn't even have a Zorro film to go see on that fateful night? But we might also use the Spanish element in American history to reflect a bit more broadly. It's no exaggeration to say that the United States encompasses the North American remains of multiple European empires. I can't help but wonder whether tensions today about such things as language, for example, speaking English or speaking Spanish, is a holdover from the imperial competition that resulted centuries ago in the Spanish and British empires colonizing different parts of what they called the New World. In other words, at least some of our cultural arguments are inherited from centuries past when there was not yet a United States. Of course, the abiding remnants of these two European empires are just two threads in American history. Religion is no less important. If we removed religion from American history, the Bill of Rights would begin very differently. And without American religious diversity, our notions of personal freedom would also look rather different. In conclusion, the point of this exercise is to note that American history contains many threads. If we privilege just one at the expense of others, we'll miss quite a lot. We might even miss the better part of what we hope to understand. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. There's no shortage of material on the Puritans, and plenty of books cover both sides of the Atlantic. Two up-to-date introductions are Michael Winship's Hot Protestants, A History of Puritanism in England and America. The other is David Hall's The Puritans, A Transatlantic History. Both books will give you an up-to-date analysis of Puritanism's very British and transatlantic history. The Spanish threads of American history are well covered in Felipe Fernandez Armesto's book, Our America, A Hispanic History of the United States. Well detailed and evidence-based, he makes the cleverly subversive argument that the United States could be perfectly well classified as part of Latin America. And finally, if you're interested in the development of religious ideas about toleration, read Tri-Faith America, How Catholics and Jews Held Post-War America to Its Protestant Promise by Kevin Schultz. It's a fascinating study of both the origins of the Judeo-Christian idea and how it then laid the foundation for more recent ideas about toleration. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.